Have you ever been laughed at by people who had no idea you held their future in your hands? Have you ever sat there, quiet, letting the mockery wash over you, while knowing that in just moments, everything was about to change? I have. And what happened next shocked everyone in that room, including myself, when I look back on it now. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what matters is what I learned about power, respect, and the dangerous game people play when they underestimate others. This is the story of how I let them finish laughing before I mentioned I was merging their division out of existence. And trust me, what came after that moment changed not just their lives, but mine forever in ways I never could have anticipated. It was a Tuesday morning, one of those grey, unremarkable days that you'd normally forget within hours, but this particular Tuesday has been burned into my memory with such clarity that I can still smell the stale coffee in that conference room and feel the cold leather of the chair beneath me. I had been with the company for nearly 8 years at that point, working my way up from a junior analyst position to eventually becoming the Vice President of Strategic Operations, a title that sounded impressive, but came with more weight and responsibility than most people could imagine. The journey hadn't been easy, far from it actually, and there were countless nights when I questioned whether the sacrifice was worth it, whether giving up weekends, holidays, and precious time with family and friends would ever lead to anything meaningful. But I kept pushing forward, driven by something deeper than ambition, something that felt more like a need to prove that hard work and integrity still mattered in a corporate world that often seemed to reward the opposite. The division I'm talking about, the one that would soon cease to exist, was located on the 7th floor of our headquarters building, a floor I had visited countless times over the years, but never felt particularly welcome on. They called themselves the Innovation Hub, a self-appointed title that always made me smirk internally, because innovation requires more than just fancy terminology and expensive coffee machines. It requires actual results, collaboration, and a willingness to evolve. This particular team had been operating with a level of autonomy that bordered on complete independence, and somewhere along the way, that independence had morphed into arrogance, a toxic belief that they were untouchable, essential, and somehow above the rules and standards that governed the rest of the organization. I had heard rumors, whispers in hallways and concerned mentions in executive meetings, but rumors are just rumors until you experience something firsthand, until it becomes your problem to solve. My first real encounter with their culture happened about 6 months before that fateful Tuesday, during a quarterly review meeting where department heads were supposed to present updates on projects, budgets, and team performance. I had been asked by the CEO to attend these meetings more regularly, to get a broader understanding of how different divisions were operating and where we might find opportunities for better integration and efficiency. When the Innovation Hub's turn came, their director, a man named Marcus, who had been with the company for 12 years and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he was irreplaceable, stood up and delivered what I can only describe as a performance rather than a presentation. He spoke in grand terms about disruption and paradigm shifts, using buzzwords that sounded impressive but meant virtually nothing when you actually analyzed the substance behind them. What struck me most wasn't his presentation style, though. It was the way his team behaved during it, the knowing glances they exchanged with each other, the barely suppressed smiles when other departments asked questions, and the overall atmosphere of superiority that hung in the air like expensive cologne, overpowering and impossible to ignore. After that meeting, I made it my business to learn more about this division, not because I had any agenda against them, but because something felt off, and in my position you develop an instinct for when things aren't quite right beneath the surface. I started reviewing their financial reports, project outcomes, and employee satisfaction surveys, and what I discovered was troubling to say the least. Despite their confident swagger and self-proclaimed innovation, their actual output was mediocre at best. Their projects consistently came in over budget and behind schedule, and perhaps most telling, their employee turnover rate was nearly double the company average. People were leaving that division as quickly as they could transfer to other departments, and when I started conducting quiet, informal conversations with some of those who had left, the stories I heard painted a picture of a work environment that was not just unproductive but genuinely toxic, a place where ideas were stolen without credit, where mistakes were blamed on the newest or most vulnerable team members, and where questioning the leadership's decisions was seen as a career-limiting. Oof, but I'm getting ahead of myself because what really matters, what this story is truly about, isn't just corporate dysfunction or management failures. Those exist everywhere if you look hard enough. What matters is what happened to me personally in that environment, how I was treated, and the moment when I realized that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is remove a cancer before it spreads further, even if the surgery is painful for everyone involved. You see, about 3 months before the final meeting, I'd been assigned to work directly with the Innovation Hub on what was supposed to be a major strategic initiative, a project that could potentially reshape how our company approached its market presence and customer engagement. The CEO had personally asked me to take this on, saying that he trusted my judgment and ability to work across divisions, and I accepted with genuine enthusiasm because I still believed, naively perhaps, that professional adults could put aside ego and work together for a common goal. My first meeting with Marcus and his core team should have been a warning sign, but I walked in with optimism and open-mindedness, ready to collaborate and contribute my expertise to what could be an exciting venture. The conference room they used for team meetings was decorated with motivational posters about thinking outside the box and disrupting the status quo, the kind of corporate decoration that either inspires you or makes you roll your eyes, depending on whether there's any substance backing it up. I had prepared a detailed presentation outlining my initial analysis, some strategic frameworks that could guide our approach, and several questions I thought we should address before moving forward. As I began to present, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten with discomfort. They weren't really listening. Marcus was checking his phone. 2 of his senior managers were having a whispered conversation about something completely unrelated, and the others were either staring blankly or looking at me with barely concealed condescension, as if my presence was an interruption to their valuable time rather than a collaboration they should have welcomed. When I finished my presentation and asked for their thoughts, the silence that followed felt deliberately uncomfortable, stretched out just long enough to make me feel awkward before Marcus finally spoke with a tone that I can only describe as patronizing, the verbal equivalent of patting someone on the head and saying, "That's nice, dear." He thanked me for my interesting perspective, but suggested that perhaps I didn't fully understand the unique dynamics of their division and the innovative approaches they employed. His team nodded along in agreement, and I felt something inside me shift, a quiet anger beginning to simmer beneath my professional exterior. But I didn't react, not then, because I've learned over years in corporate environments that emotional responses rarely serve you well in the moment, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm, observe, and gather information before deciding on your next move. So I smiled, thanked them for their feedback, and said I looked forward to our continued collaboration, all while mentally noting everything that had just happened and filing it away for future reference. Over the following weeks, my interactions with that division became increasingly frustrating and, I'll be honest, personally hurtful in ways that professional setbacks shouldn't be but somehow are when they touch on your sense of competence and worth. Every suggestion I made was dismissed or ignored. Every report I submitted was met with criticism that felt less like constructive feedback and more like an attempt to undermine my credibility. And in meetings with other executives where the project was discussed, I noticed that Marcus had a habit of presenting ideas I had developed as if they were his own original thoughts, never once acknowledging my contribution or the work I had put in. I started to feel invisible, or worse, visible only as a target for their collective disdain, and there were nights when I drove home from the office with tears of frustration burning behind my eyes, wondering why I had worked so hard to reach a position of leadership, only to be treated like an incompetent intern by people whose actual results didn't justify their attitude. The breaking point came during a presentation to the board of directors, one of those high-stakes meetings where careers can be made or broken depending on how well you perform under pressure. Marcus was supposed to present the strategic initiative we had been working on, and I was there as a supporting executive, ready to answer questions about the operational and financial aspects of the plan. As he presented, I realized with growing horror that he had not only taken credit for my work, but had actually altered some of the key strategic recommendations in ways that I knew from my analysis would likely lead to failure. The changes he made looked good on slides. They sounded impressive when described with confident language, but they ignored fundamental market realities and financial constraints that I had explicitly warned about in my reports. I sat there, my heart pounding, facing a choice that felt impossible in that moment. Do I speak up and potentially embarrass a colleague in front of the board, or do I stay silent and let a flawed strategy move forward, knowing that when it failed, the blame would likely be shared by everyone involved, including me? I chose to speak up, but I did it carefully, professionally, framing my concerns as questions rather than accusations, asking Marcus to clarify certain points and explain how specific challenges would be addressed. The look he gave me across that conference table was pure venom, a flash of anger quickly masked by his practiced smile, and when he responded, his tone carried an edge that everyone in the room could hear. He suggested that perhaps I was being overly cautious, that innovation requires taking risks, and that those who couldn't embrace bold thinking might be more comfortable with more traditional approaches. It was a dismissal, a public diminishment of my expertise and judgment, and I felt my face grow hot with humiliation as several board members nodded along with his response, clearly impressed by his confidence and apparently untroubled by the substance of my concerns. The meeting ended with approval to move forward with the project as Marcus had presented it, and as we filed out of the boardroom, I heard laughter behind me, the distinctive voices of Marcus and his core team, and though I couldn't hear the exact words, I knew instinctively that I was the subject of their amusement. That night, I did something I rarely allow myself to do. I let myself feel the full weight of the anger, frustration, and hurt that I had been pushing down for months. I sat in my home office, looking at all the work I had done, the analysis and reports that had been dismissed or stolen, and I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to stop trying to collaborate with people who had no interest in actual collaboration, and instead I would do what I had been hired to do, what my position required of me, which was to make strategic decisions that served the best interests of the entire company, even when those decisions were difficult and would make me deeply unpopular with certain people. I started working on a comprehensive analysis of the Innovation Hub, documenting everything I had observed and experienced, gathering data on their actual performance versus their self-reported success, and building a case that I knew would be undeniable once I presented it to the right people. The investigation I conducted over the next several weeks was thorough, and I'll admit, somewhat cathartic. Every late night spent poring over spreadsheets and project reports, every conversation with former employees who finally felt safe enough to share their experiences, every piece of evidence that confirmed what I had suspected, it all fueled my determination to see this through regardless of the personal cost. What I discovered went beyond simple underperformance or bad management. I found evidence of budget manipulation, where expenses were being shifted between projects to make certain initiatives look more cost-effective than they actually were. I documented instances of intellectual property concerns, where ideas from other departments were being rebranded as Innovation Hub creations, and perhaps most seriously, I uncovered a pattern of HR complaints that had been filed over the past 3 years. Complaints about hostile work environment, discrimination and retaliation that had somehow never resulted in any meaningful action or consequence for those responsible. As I compiled all of this information into a detailed report, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in finally having concrete evidence to back up what I had been experiencing, but there was also sadness, because I understood that what I was about to set in motion would have real consequences for real people, many of whom were probably decent individuals who had simply been caught up in a toxic culture created by leadership. I thought about the junior employees in that division who came to work every day trying to do their best, despite the dysfunction around them, and I worried about what would happen to them when the hammer finally fell. But I also thought about all the talented people who had left the company because of that division's toxic culture, all the potential and innovation that had been lost because ego and arrogance had been allowed to flourish unchecked, and I knew that sometimes you have to make hard decisions not because they feel good, but because they're necessary for the health of the larger organization. Have you ever been in a position where you knew you were about to change people's lives forever, and the weight of that responsibility felt almost too heavy to bear? Comment below if you've ever had to make a decision that you knew would hurt people but felt was ultimately the right thing to do. I'm curious to hear your experiences because even now, looking back on what happened, I still sometimes question whether I did the right thing or if there was another path I didn't see at the time. The process of getting approval for what I was proposing was more complex than simply presenting my findings and getting a green light. Corporate restructuring, especially when it involves eliminating an entire division, requires careful legal review, consultation with HR, approval from the board, and strategic planning about how to minimize disruption to ongoing operations. I spent hours in meetings with our legal team, going over every piece of evidence to ensure that our case was solid and would withstand any potential challenges or lawsuits that might follow. I worked with HR to develop transition plans for the employees who would be affected, identifying opportunities for some to be reassigned to other departments where their skills could be better utilized and more appreciated. And I met repeatedly with the CEO and key board members, walking them through not just the problems, but also my proposed solution, which involved not eliminating the functions that the Innovation Hub was supposed to perform, but rather distributing those responsibilities across existing departments that had proven track records of actual innovation and collaboration. The CEO's reaction to my report was telling. He spent almost 3 hours reading through all the documentation I had prepared, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification on specific points. And when he finally looked up at me, I saw something in his expression that I hadn't expected. It was relief mixed with guilt. He admitted that he had known something was wrong with that division for quite some time, that he had received indirect feedback and heard rumors, but he had been hesitant to take action because Marcus had been with the company for so long and had powerful relationships with several board members who appreciated his confidence and charisma, even if they didn't fully understand or question his actual results. The CEO thanked me for having the courage to do what he should have done himself, and in that moment, I realized that sometimes leadership isn't about having all the answers or being the most popular person in the room. It's about being willing to address difficult truths, even when it would be easier to look the other way and hope problems resolve themselves. Getting board approval was the final hurdle, and it required a presentation that was simultaneously comprehensive and diplomatic, laying out the case for restructuring while being careful not to make it seem like a personal vendetta or witch hunt. I spent days preparing for that presentation, anticipating every possible question or objection, and when the day finally came, I delivered what I believe was one of the most important presentations of my career. I showed them the financial data, demonstrating the division's consistent underperformance, the employee satisfaction metrics that told a story of systemic dysfunction, the project outcomes that revealed a pattern of missed deadlines and inflated promises, and perhaps most compellingly, I presented anonymous testimonials from former employees that painted a vivid picture of what it was actually like to work in that environment. By the time I finished, the decision was essentially made, though it still required formal votes and legal processes to complete. The board approved the restructuring plan with only minor modifications, and suddenly, what had been a concept on paper became a reality that would need to be implemented, communicated, and managed through what I knew would be a difficult transition period. The days leading up to the announcement were some of the strangest of my professional life. I knew what was coming. I had been instrumental in making it happen, but I still had to maintain normal working relationships with the people who had no idea their world was about to be turned upside down. I had to attend meetings where Marcus and his team continued their usual behavior, the dismissiveness and superiority that had characterized all our interactions, and I had to sit there knowing that very soon the dynamic would shift in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. There was a temptation to give some kind of warning, to hint that changes were coming, or to suggest that people might want to update their resumes, but I knew that would be inappropriate and could potentially complicate the legal and HR processes that had been carefully planned. So I said nothing. I maintained my professionalism, and I waited for the day that had been circled on my calendar with a mixture of anticipation and dread. That day arrived on a Tuesday, which is where this story really begins, where the moment I described at the very start finally comes into full context. The meeting had been scheduled as a routine quarterly review, the same kind of meeting we had had many times before, and there was no indication in the calendar invitation or agenda that anything unusual was going to happen. Marcus and his entire team were present, about 15 people in total, gathered in their preferred conference room with the motivational posters and the expensive coffee machine, all of them relaxed and confident as they waited for the meeting to begin. I arrived exactly on time, carrying only a single folder and my laptop, and I took a seat near the end of the table rather than at the head where Marcus typically positioned himself. The CEO was also present, along with our chief legal officer and the head of HR, a combination that should have been a warning sign, but apparently wasn't noticed or was simply assumed to be routine executive oversight. Marcus started the meeting the way he always did, with confident patter about the exciting projects his team was working on and the innovative approaches they were developing. His senior managers chimed in with their own updates, each one trying to outdo the others with impressive-sounding terminology and bold claims about future potential. I sat quietly, listening, watching, noting the familiar patterns of behavior that had frustrated me for so long. And then something happened that became the catalyst for the moment that would define this entire experience. One of Marcus's managers, a woman named Jennifer who had always been particularly dismissive of my contributions, made a joke about corporate oversight and how it was important to humor the executives who didn't really understand innovation but needed to feel included in the process. The room erupted in laughter, that comfortable laughter of people who feel completely secure in their position and believe they're among friends who share their perspective. I felt the CEO shift in his seat beside me, clearly uncomfortable with what he was hearing, and I knew that this was the moment. I let them finish laughing. I let the sound die down naturally as people caught their breath and wiped tears of amusement from their eyes, and then in the quiet that followed, I spoke with a clarity and calmness that surprised even me, given how fast my heart was racing. I said, and I remember the exact words because they've been replayed in my mind countless times since then, I'm glad everyone is in such good spirits this morning because I have some important news to share. Effective immediately, the Innovation Hub as a separate division is being dissolved and merged into other departments across the organization. Your roles as they currently exist are being eliminated, and over the next 60 days we'll be working with each of you individually to explore reassignment opportunities within the company, or, if that's not possible or desired, to provide transition support as you pursue opportunities elsewhere. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that feels physical, that presses against your eardrums and makes you acutely aware of every small sound, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant traffic outside, your own breathing. Every face in that room went through a rapid progression of expressions, from confusion to disbelief to shock to anger, and I watched it all while maintaining my professional composure, which took every ounce of self-control I possessed. Marcus was the first to find his voice, and when he spoke it was with a tone I had never heard from him before, stripped of confidence and bravado, raw with genuine shock. He asked if this was some kind of joke, if we were serious, how this could possibly be happening without any warning or discussion. I explained, keeping my voice steady and professional, that this decision had been made after extensive analysis and review at the highest levels of the organization, that it was final and not subject to negotiation, and that while I understood this was difficult news to receive, we were committed to handling the transition as professionally and supportively as possible. ¿Te ha pasado algo similar en tu vida profesional? Un momento donde todo cambió en un instante. Cuéntamelo en los comentarios. The meeting that followed was one of the most professionally challenging experiences of my career. There were accusations, there were demands for explanations, there were threats of lawsuits and appeals to board members who some of them believed would override this decision. Marcus, in particular, became increasingly agitated, his usual composure completely shattered as he realized that what was happening was real and irreversible. He demanded to know why he hadn't been consulted, why there had been no opportunity to address concerns or improve performance, why this decision was being made so suddenly. I remained calm, referring questions to the appropriate people, the CEO for strategic rationale, the CLO for legal matters, the head of HR for transition details, and refusing to be drawn into emotional arguments or personal attacks. At one point, Jennifer, the same manager who had made the joke about corporate oversight just minutes earlier, looked directly at me and asked if I was behind this, if this was some kind of revenge for not being taken seriously by their team. I met her gaze and simply said that this decision was based on objective analysis of performance, culture, and strategic fit, and that it had been approved at the highest levels of the organization after careful consideration of all factors. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, the atmosphere in the room shifted from shock and anger to something more somber and uncertain. People started asking practical questions about severance packages, about how references would be handled, about whether there were truly opportunities for reassignment, or if that was just corporate speak for, "You're all being fired." The HR director provided detailed information about the support that would be available, the generous severance packages that had been approved, the outplacement services that would be provided, and the genuine effort that would be made to find suitable positions within the company for those who wanted to stay and whom we believed could thrive in healthier environments. I could see some people, particularly the more junior employees who had probably been as frustrated by the division's culture as I had been, processing this news with mixed emotions, fear about their immediate future, but perhaps also relief that they would no longer have to work in an environment that had made them miserable. The meeting finally ended after nearly 2 hours, far longer than the 30 minutes that had been originally scheduled, and as people slowly filed out of the conference room, I remained seated, needing a moment to process what had just happened and how I felt about it. The CEO stayed behind as well, and he thanked me again for my work on this, acknowledging that it had been a difficult process and that delivering the news had required real courage. But his thanks didn't make me feel better in that moment. If anything, I felt exhausted and emotionally drained, questioning whether the satisfaction of finally addressing a toxic situation was worth the cost of knowing that I had just fundamentally disrupted the lives of 15 people, some of whom probably didn't deserve what had happened to them, simply because they had the misfortune of working under bad leadership. Over the following days and weeks, the aftermath of that announcement rippled through the entire organization in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Some people in other departments who had suffered under the Innovation Hub's arrogance or had lost talented colleagues because of that division's toxicity privately thanked me and expressed relief that the situation had finally been addressed. Others, particularly those who had been friends with Marcus or his team outside of work, treated me with a new coldness, as if I had done something cruel rather than making a difficult but necessary business decision. I found myself having conversations with employees who had worked in that division, some angry and accusatory, others appreciative that someone had finally recognized and acted on problems they had been complaining about for years. Each conversation was difficult in its own way, requiring me to balance empathy for individual circumstances with maintaining the confidentiality of the investigation and decision-making process that had led to the restructuring. Marcus himself left the company within 2 weeks, declining any reassignment opportunities and negotiating a departure package that allowed him to exit on his own terms. Before he left, he sent me an email that I still have saved, not because I'm proud of it, but because it serves as a reminder of how differently people can perceive the same situation. In it, he accused me of vindictiveness and political maneuvering, claiming that I had orchestrated the division's elimination because I couldn't handle working with people who challenged my ideas and exposed my limitations. He said that I would ultimately fail because I didn't understand real innovation and had eliminated the only part of the company that was truly forward-thinking. Reading that email, I felt a deep sadness, not anger or vindication, but sadness that someone could be so blind to the reality of what had happened, so unable to see how their own behavior and leadership had created the situation that led to their downfall. I never responded to that email because I knew that nothing I could say would change his perspective or make him understand what he had failed to see all along. Jennifer and 2 other senior managers from the division also chose to leave the company, finding positions elsewhere rather than accepting reassignment, to roles that would have been lateral moves at best and in some cases represented steps down from what they had held before. I understood their choice, even respected it in a way, because staying in an organization after that kind of professional setback would have been difficult, and sometimes a fresh start somewhere new is the healthiest option. But several of the junior and mid-level employees from the division did accept reassignment opportunities, and over time I heard from managers in their new departments that many of them were thriving in environments where their contributions were valued and their ideas were actually implemented rather than stolen or dismissed. That feedback gave me some comfort, a sense that perhaps the disruption had created opportunity for people who deserved better than what they had been experiencing. The project that Marcus had presented to the board, the one that had been approved over my concerns, was reassigned to a different team with instructions to conduct a fresh analysis before implementation. Within a month, that team came back with recommendations that aligned almost exactly with the concerns I had raised in that board meeting, and the project was substantially modified before moving forward. When it finally launched 6 months later, it was successful. Not wildly transformative the way Marcus had promised, but solidly successful in ways that were sustainable and profitable. The CEO mentioned to me privately that the board members who had been most impressed by Marcus's presentation had commented on how my instincts had been correct and that they had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between confidence and competence. I appreciated the acknowledgement, but more than that, I was relieved that the company hadn't suffered the failure that I had feared would result from the original flawed strategy. As months passed and the dust settled from the restructuring, I found myself reflecting deeply on the entire experience and what it had taught me about leadership, power, and human nature. I thought about how easily talented people can be dismissed or undervalued simply because they don't fit certain expectations or don't perform confidence the way others do. I thought about how toxic cultures can persist and even thrive in organizations when leadership either doesn't recognize the problem or lacks the courage to address it. I thought about the responsibility that comes with having power over people's careers and livelihoods, and how that responsibility should be taken seriously and exercised with both strength and compassion. And I thought about myself, about the person I had become through this experience, and whether I had handled everything as well as I could have, or if there were things I would do differently if faced with a similar situation in the future. One thing I learned through all of this is that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. In fact, sometimes it feels terrible, even when you know intellectually that it was necessary. I learned that standing up for yourself and setting boundaries in professional environments can have real costs, not just for others but for yourself as well, and that you have to be prepared to live with those costs when you make difficult decisions. I learned that confidence without competence is ultimately empty, that true innovation comes from collaboration and mutual respect rather than ego and superiority, and that sustainable success is built on solid foundations rather than impressive presentations. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do, both for individuals and for an organization, is to make changes that are painful in the short term, but create healthier environments in the long term. Looking back now on that Tuesday morning when I let them finish laughing before delivering the news that would change everything, I still feel the weight of that moment, the responsibility and the sadness and the determination all mixed together. I don't regret the decision, but I also don't celebrate it because at the end of the day, it was about addressing dysfunction rather than achieving some kind of personal victory. The people who lost their jobs that day weren't villains. They were human beings with families and bills and dreams, and even though some of them had treated me poorly, I took no joy in disrupting their lives. What I do feel is a sense of having done what my position required, what the organization needed, and what ultimately served the greater good, even though it came at a personal cost to specific individuals. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you for listening to this complicated, messy, very human tale of workplace dynamics and difficult decisions. I hope it's given you something to think about, whether it's about your own workplace situations, about how you treat colleagues at different levels of an organization, about the difference between confidence and arrogance, or about the responsibilities that come with leadership positions. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt underestimated or disrespected at work? Have you ever had to make a decision that was right but difficult, that served the greater good but caused pain to specific people? I really want to hear your stories and perspectives in the comments below, because these kinds of experiences are so common yet so rarely discussed openly and honestly. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about workplace dynamics or gave you courage to stand up for yourself in professional situations where you've been dismissed or undervalued, please leave a like on this video. Your engagement helps others find these stories and creates a community where we can share our experiences and learn from each other's challenges and triumphs. And if you want to hear more real, unfiltered stories about the complicated realities of professional life, about moments that changed everything, about decisions that required courage and wisdom, then please subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales and hit that notification bell. This channel is dedicated to sharing authentic human experiences, The kind of stories that don't get told in corporate training sessions or professional development workshops, but that contain the real lessons we need to navigate our careers and lives with integrity and purpose. Remember, the next time someone underestimates you, dismisses your contributions, or treats you as if your perspective doesn't matter, that people who truly have power don't need to constantly demonstrate it or diminish others to feel secure in their position. True leadership is about creating environments where everyone can contribute their best work, where respect flows in all directions, and where confidence is earned through results rather than borrowed through arrogance. And sometimes true leadership means making decisions that will make you unpopular, that will cost you relationships, but that serve the greater good and create healthier organizations for everyone who remains. Thank you for watching, for engaging, and for being part of this community where real stories matter and authentic voices are valued. Until next time, remember that your truth matters, your experiences have value, and your voice deserves to be heard.